Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 5. The Second Ring of Power. The Generos. I woke up around 8 the next morning and found that Lagorda had sunned my clothes and made breakfast. We ate in the kitchen, in the dining area. When we had finished, I asked her about Lydia, Rosa and Josefina. They seemed to have vanished from the house. They are helping Soledad, she said. She's getting ready to leave. Where is she going? Somewhere away from here. She has no more reason to stay. She was waiting for you and you have already come. Are the little sisters going with her? No. They just don't want to be here today. It looks as if today is not a good day for them to stick around. Why isn't it a good day? The Generos are coming to see you today, and the girls don't get along with them. If all of them are here together, they'll get into a most dreadful fight. The last time that happened, they nearly killed one another. Do they fight physically? You bet they do. All of them are very strong, and none of them wants to take second place. The Nagual told me that that would happen, but I am powerless to stop them, and not only that, but I have to take sides, so it's a mess. How do you know that the Generos are coming today? I haven't talked to them. I just know that they will be here today, that's all. Do you know that because you see, Gorda? That's right. I see them coming. And one of them is coming directly to you because you're pulling him. I assured her that I was not pulling anyone in particular. I said that I had not revealed to anyone the purpose of my trip, but that it had to do with something I had to ask Pablito and Nestor. She smiled coyly and said that fate had paired me with Pablito, that we were very alike, and that undoubtedly he was going to see me first. She added that everything that happened to a warrior could be interpreted as an omen. Thus my encounter with Soledad was an omen of what I was going to find out on my visit. I asked her to explain her point. The men will give you very little this time, she said. It's the women who will rip you to shreds, as Soledad did. That's what I would say if I read the omen. You're waiting for the Generos, but they are men like you. And look at this other omen. They are a little bit behind. I would say a couple of days behind. That's your fate as well as theirs, as men, to be always a couple of days behind. Behind what, Gorda? Behind everything. Behind us women, for instance. She laughed and patted my head. No matter how stubborn you are, she went on, you have to admit that I'm right. Wait and see. Did the Nagual tell you that men are behind women? I asked. Sure he did, she replied. All you have to do is look around. I do, Gorda. But I don't see any such thing. Women are always behind. They are dependent on men. She laughed. Her laughter was not scornful or bitter, it was rather a clear sound of joyfulness. You know the world of people better than I do, she said forcefully. But right now I'm formless and you're not. I'm telling you, women are better sorcerers because there is a crack in front of our eyes, and there is none in front of yours. She did not seem angry, but I felt obliged to explain that I asked questions and made comments not because I was attacking or defending any given point, but because I wanted her to talk. She said that she had done nothing else but talk since the moment we met, and that the Nagual had trained her to talk because her task was the same as mine, to be in the world of people. Everything we say, she went on, is a reflection of the world of people. You will find out before your visit is over that you talk and act the way you do because you're clinging to the human form, just as the Generos and the Little Sisters are clinging to the human form when they fight to kill one another. But aren't all of you supposed to cooperate with Pablito, Nestor and Benigno? Genero and the Nagual told every one of us that we should live in harmony and help and protect one another, because we are alone in the world. Pablito was left in charge of us four, but he's a coward. If it were left up to him, he would let us die like dogs. When the Nagual was around, though, Pablito was very nice to us and took very good care of us. Everyone used to tease him and joke that he took care of us as if we were his wives. The Nagual and Genero told him, not too long before they left, that he had a real chance to become the Nagual someday, because we might become his four winds, his four corners. Pablito understood it to be his task, and from that day on he changed. He became insufferable. He began to order us around as if we were really his wives. I asked the Nagual about Pablito's chances, and he told me that I should know that everything in a warrior's world depends on personal power, and personal power depends on impeccability. If Pablito were impeccable, he would have a chance. I laughed when he told me that. I know Pablito very well. But the Nagual explained to me that I shouldn't take it so lightly. He said that warriors always have a chance, no matter how slim. He made me see that I was a warrior myself, and that I shouldn't hinder Pablito with my thoughts. He said that I should turn them off and let Pablito be, that the impeccable thing for me to do was to help Pablito in spite of what I knew about him. I understood what the Nagual said. Besides, I have my own debt with Pablito, and I welcomed the opportunity to help him. But I also knew that no matter how I helped him, he was going to fail. I knew all along that he didn't have what it takes to be like the Nagual. Pablito is very childish and he won't accept his defeat. He's miserable because he's not impeccable, and yet he's still trying in his thoughts to be like the Nagual. How did he fail? As soon as the Nagual left, Pablito had a deadly run-in with Lydia. Years ago the Nagual had given him the task of being Lydia's husband, just for appearances. The people around here thought that she was his wife. Lydia didn't like that one bit. She's very tough. The truth of the matter is that Pablito has always been scared to death of her. They could never get along together, and they tolerated each other only because the Nagual was around. But when he left, Pablito got crazier than he already was, and became convinced that he had enough personal power to take us as his wives. The three Generos got together and discussed what Pablito should do, and decided that he should take the toughest woman first, Lydia. They waited until she was alone, and then all three of them came into the house and grabbed her by the arms and threw her on the bed. Pablito got on top of her. She thought at first that the Generos were joking. But when she realized that they were serious, she hit Pablito with her head in the middle of his forehead and nearly killed him. The Generos fled and Nestor had to tend to Pablito's wound for months. Is there something that I can do to help them understand? No. Unfortunately, understanding is not their problem. All six of them understand very well. The real trouble is something else, something very ugly that no one can help them with. They indulge in not trying to change. Since they know they won't succeed in changing no matter how much they try, or want to, or need to, they have given up trying altogether. That's as wrong as feeling disappointed with our failures. The Nagual told each of them that warriors, both men and women, must be impeccable in their effort to change, in order to scare the human form and shake it away. After years of impeccability a moment will come, the Nagual said, when the form cannot stand it any longer and it leaves, just as it left me. In doing so, of course, it injures the body and can even make it die, but an impeccable warrior survives, always. A sudden knock at the front door interrupted her. Lagorda stood up and went over to unlatch the door. It was Lydia. She greeted me very formally and asked Lagorda to go with her. They left together. I welcomed being alone. I worked on my notes for hours. The open-air dining area was cool and had very good light. Lagorda returned around noon. She asked me if I wanted to eat. I was not hungry, but she insisted that I eat. She said that contacts with the Allies were very debilitating and that she felt very weak herself. After eating, I sat down with Lagorda and was getting ready to ask her about dreaming when the front door opened loudly and Pablito walked in. He was panting. He obviously had been running and appeared to be in a state of great excitation. He stood at the door for a moment, catching his breath. He hadn't changed much. He seemed a bit older, or heavier, or perhaps only more muscular. He was, however, still very lean and wiry. His complexion was pale, as if he had not been in the sun for a long time. The brownness of his eyes was accentuated by a faint mark of weariness in his face. I remembered Pablito as having a beguiling smile. As he stood there looking at me, his smile was as charming as ever. He ran over to where I was sitting and grasped my forearms for a moment, without saying a word. I stood up. He then shook me gently and embraced me. I myself was utterly delighted to see him. I was jumping up and down with an infantile joy. I did not know what to say to him. He finally broke the silence. "Maestro," he said softly, nodding his head slightly as if he were bowing to me. The title of Maestro, teacher, caught me by surprise. I turned around as if I were looking for someone else who was just behind me. I deliberately exaggerated my movements to let him know that I was mystified. He smiled, and the only thing that occurred to me was to ask him how he knew I was there. He said that he, Nestor and Benigno had been forced to return because of a most unusual apprehension, which made them run day and night without any pause. Nestor had gone to their own house to find out if there was something there that would account for the feeling that had driven them. Benigno had gone to Soledad's place, and he himself had come to the girl's house. "You hit the jackpot, Pablito," Lagorda said, and laughed. Pablito did not answer. He glared at her. "I'll bet that you're working yourself up to throw me out," he said in a tone of great anger. "Don't fight with me, Pablito," Lagorda said, unruffled. Pablito turned to me and apologized, and then added in a very loud voice, as if he wanted someone else in the house to hear him, that he had brought his own chair to sit on, and that he could put it wherever he pleased. "There's no one else around here except us," Lagorda said softly, and chuckled. "I'll bring in my chair anyway," Pablito said. "You don't mind, Maestro, do you?" I looked at Lagorda. She gave me an almost imperceptible go-ahead sign with the tip of her foot. "Bring it in." "Bring anything you want," I said. Pablito stepped out of the house. "They're all that way," Lagorda said, "all three of them." Pablito came back a moment later carrying an unusual-looking chair on his shoulders. The chair was shaped to follow the contour of his back, so when he had it on his shoulders, upside down, it looked like a backpack. "May I put it down?" he asked me. "Of course," I replied, moving the bench over to make room. He laughed with exaggerated ease. "Aren't you the Nagual?" he asked me, and then looked at Lagorda and added, "Or do you have to wait for orders?" "I am the Nagual," I said facetiously in order to humor him. I sensed that he was about to pick a fight with Lagorda. She must have sensed it too, for she excused herself and went out the back. Pablito put his chair down and slowly circled around me as if he were inspecting my body. Then he took his low-back narrow chair in one hand, turned it around and sat down, resting his folded arms on the back of the chair that was made to allow him the maximum comfort as he sat astride it. I sat down facing him. His mood had changed completely the instant Lagorda left. "I must ask you to forgive me for acting the way I did," he said, smiling. "But I had to get rid of that witch." "Is she that bad, Pablito?" "You can bet on that," he replied. To change the subject, I told him that he looked very fine and prosperous. "You look very fine yourself, Maestro," he said. "What's this nonsense of calling me Maestro?" I asked in a joking tone. "Things are not the same as before," he replied. "We are in a new realm, and the witness says that you're a Maestro now, and the witness cannot be wrong. But he will tell you the whole story himself. He'll be here shortly, and will he be glad to see you again? I think that by now he must have felt that you are here. As we were coming back, all of us had the feeling that you might be on your way, but none of us felt that you had already arrived." I told him then that I had come for the sole purpose of seeing him and Nestor, that they were the only two people in the world with whom I could talk about our last meeting with Don Juan and Don Genaro, and that I needed more than anything else to clear up the uncertainties that last meeting had created in me. "We're bound to one another," he said. "I'll do anything I can to help. You know that. But I must warn you that I'm not as strong as you would want me to be. Perhaps it would be better if we didn't talk at all. But, on the other hand, if we don't talk, we'll never understand anything." In a careful and deliberate manner I formulated my query. I explained that there was one single issue at the crux of my rational predicament. "Tell me, Pablito," I said, "did we truly jump with our bodies into the abyss?" "I don't know," he said. "I really don't know. But you were there with me. That's the point." "Was I really there?" I felt annoyed at his cryptic replies. I had the sensation that if I would shake him or squeeze him, something in him would be set free. It was apparent to me that he was deliberately withholding something of great value. I protested that he would choose to be secretive with me when we had a bond of total trust. Pablito shook his head as if silently objecting to my accusation. I asked him to recount to me his whole experience, starting from the time prior to our jump, when Don Juan and Don Genaro had prepared us together for the final onslaught. Pablito's account was muddled and inconsistent. All he could remember about the last moments before we jumped into the abyss was that after Don Juan and Don Genaro had said goodbye to both of us and had disappeared into the darkness, his strength waned. He was about to fall on his face, but I held him by his arm and carried him to the edge of the abyss, and there he blacked out. "What happened after you blacked out, Pablito?" "I don't know." "Did you have dreams or visions? What did you see?" "As far as I'm concerned, I had no visions, or if I did, I couldn't pay any attention to them." My lack of impeccability makes it impossible for me to remember them. And then what happened? I woke up at Gennaro's old place. I don't know how I got there. He remained quiet while I frantically searched in my mind for a question, a comment, a critical statement, or anything that would add extra breadth to his statements. As it was, nothing in Pablito's account was usable to buttress what had happened to me. I felt cheated. I was almost angry with him. My feelings were a mixture of pity for Pablito and myself, and at the same time a most intense disappointment. "I'm sorry I'm such a letdown to you," Pablito said. My immediate reaction to his words was to cover up my feelings and assure him that I was not disappointed at all. "I am a sorcerer," he said, laughing, "a poor one, but enough of a one to know what my body tells me. And right now it tells me that you are angry with me." "I'm not angry, Pablito," I exclaimed. "That's what your reason says, but not your body," he said. "Your body is angry. Your reason, however, finds no reason to feel anger toward me, so you're caught in a crossfire. The least I can do for you is to untangle this. Your body is angry because it knows that I am not impeccable, and that only an impeccable warrior can help you. Your body is angry because it feels that I am wasting myself. It knew all that the minute I walked through that door. I did not know what to say. I felt a flood of post-fact realizations. Perhaps he was right in saying that my body knew all that. At any rate, his directness in confronting me with my feelings had blunted the edge of my frustration. I began to wonder if Pablito was not just playing a game with me. I told him that being so direct and bold, he could not possibly be as weak as he pictured himself to be. "My weakness is that I'm made to have longings," he said almost in a whisper. "I'm even to the point where I long for my life as an ordinary man." "Can you believe that? You can't be serious, Pablito," I exclaimed. "I am," he replied. "I long for the grand privilege of walking the face of the earth as an ordinary man, without this awesome burden." I found his stand simply preposterous and caught myself exclaiming over and over that he could not possibly be serious. Pablito looked at me and sighed. I was overtaken by a sudden apprehension. He seemed to be on the verge of tears. My apprehension gave way to an intense feeling of empathy. Neither of us could help each other. Lagorda came back to the kitchen at that moment. Pablito seemed to experience an instantaneous revitalization. He jumped to his feet and stomped on the floor. "What the hell do you want?" he yelled in a shrill, nervous voice. "Why are you snooping around?" Lagorda addressed me as if he did not exist. She politely said that she was going to Soledad's house. "What the hell do we care where you go?" he yelled. "You can go to hell for that matter." He stomped on the floor like a spoiled child, while Lagorda stood there laughing. "Let's get out of this house. Maestro," he said loudly. His sudden shift from sadness to anger fascinated me. I became engrossed in watching him. One of the features that I had always admired was his nimbleness. Even when he stomped his feet, his movements had grace. He suddenly reached across the table and nearly snatched my writing pad away from me. He grabbed it with the thumb and index finger of his left hand. I had to hold onto it with both hands, using all my strength. There was such an extraordinary force in his pull that if he had really wanted to take it, he could have easily jerked it away from my grip. He let go, and as he retrieved his hand, I saw a fleeting image of an extension to it. It happened so fast that I could have explained it as a visual distortion on my part, a product of the jolt of having to stand up halfway, drawn by the force of his pull. But I had learned by then that I could neither behave with those people in my accustomed manner, nor could I explain anything in my accustomed manner, so I did not even try. "What's that in your hand, Pablito?" I asked. He recoiled in surprise and hid his hand behind his back. He had a blank expression and mumbled that he wanted us to leave that house because he was becoming dizzy. LaGorda began to laugh loudly and said that Pablito was as good a deceiver as Josefina, maybe even better, and that if I pressed him to tell me what was in his hand he would faint, and Nestor would have to tend to him for months. Pablito began to choke. His face became almost purple. LaGorda told him in a nonchalant tone to cut out the acting because he had no audience. She was leaving and I did not have much patience. She then turned to me and told me in a most commanding tone to stay there and not go to the Genero's house. "Why in the hell not?" Pablito yelled and jumped in front of her as if trying to stop her from leaving. "What gall? Telling the maestro what to do? We had a bout with the allies in your house last night," LaGorda said to Pablito matter-of-factly. "The Nagual and I are still weak from that. If I were you, Pablito, I would put my attention to work. Things have changed. Everything has changed since he came." LaGorda left through the front door. I became aware then that indeed she looked very tired. Her shoes seemed too tight, or perhaps she was so weak that her feet dragged a little bit. She seemed small and frail. I thought that I must have looked as tired. Since there were no mirrors in their house, I had the urge to go outside and look at myself in the side mirror of my car. I perhaps would have done it, but Pablito thwarted me. He asked me in the most earnest tone not to believe a word of what she had said about his being a deceiver. I told him not to worry about that. "You don't like LaGorda at all, do you?" I asked. "You can say that again," he replied with a fierce look. "You know better than anyone alive the kind of monsters those women are. The Nagual told us that one day you were going to come here just to fall into their trap. He begged us to be on the alert and warn you about their designs. The Nagual said that you had 1 out of 4 chances. If our power was high, we could bring you here ourselves and warn you and save you. If our power was low, we ourselves would arrive here just in time to see your corpse. The 3rd chance was to find you either the slave to the witch Soledad or the slave of those disgusting, mannish women. The 4th chance, and the faintest one of all, was to find you alive and well. The Nagual told us that in case you survived, you would then be the Nagual, and we should trust you, because only you could help us. I'll do anything for you, Pablito. You know that. Not just for me. I'm not alone. The witness and Benigno are with me. We are together and you have to help all of us. Of course, Pablito. That goes without saying. People around here have never bothered us. Our problems are with those ugly, mannish freaks. We don't know what to do with them. The Nagual gave us orders to stay around them no matter what. He gave me a personal task, but I failed at it. I was very happy before. You remember. Now I can't seem to manage my life anymore. What happened, Pablito? Those witches drove me from my house. They took over and pushed me out like trash. I now live in Genero's house with Nestor and Benigno. We even have to cook our own meals. The Nagual knew that this might happen, and gave Lagorda the task of mediating between us and those three bitches. But Lagorda is still what the Nagual used to call her, 220 buttocks. That was her nickname for years and years, because she tipped the scales at 220 pounds. Pablito chuckled at his recollection of Lagorda. She was the fattest, smelliest slob you'd ever want to see, he went on. Today she's half her real size, but she's still the same fat, slow woman up there in her head, and she can't do a thing for us. But you're here now, Maestro, and our worries are over. Now we are 4 against 4. I wanted to interject a comment, but he stopped me. Let me finish what I have to say before that witch comes back to throw me out, he said as he nervously looked at the door. I know that they have told you that the 5 of you are the same because you are the Nagual's children. That's a lie. You're also like us, the Generos, because Genero also helped to make your luminosity. You're one of us too. See what I mean? So, don't you believe what they tell you? You also belong to us. The witches don't know that the Nagual told us everything. They think that they are the only ones who know. It took 2 Toltecs to make us. We are the children of both. Those witches. Wait, Pablito, I said, putting my hand over his mouth. He stood up, apparently frightened by my sudden movement. What do you mean that it took 2 Toltecs to make us? The Nagual told us that we are Toltecs. All of us are Toltecs. He said that a Toltec is the receiver and holder of mysteries. The Nagual and Genero are Toltecs. They gave us their special luminosity and their mysteries. We received their mysteries and now we hold them. His usage of the word Toltec baffled me. I was familiar only with its anthropological meaning. In that context, it always refers to a culture of Nahuatl-speaking people in central and southern Mexico, which was already extinct at the time of the conquest. Why did he call us Toltecs? I asked, not knowing what else to say. Because that's what we are. Instead of saying that we are sorcerers or witches, he said that we are Toltecs. If that's the case, why do you call the Little Sisters witches? Oh, that's because I hate them. That has nothing to do with what we are. Did the Nagual tell that to everyone? Why, certainly. Everyone knows. But he never told me that. Oh, that's because you are a very educated man and are always discussing stupid things. He laughed in a forced, high-pitched tone and patted me on the back. Did the Nagual by any chance tell you that the Toltecs were ancient people that lived in this part of Mexico? I asked. See, there you go. That's why he didn't tell you. The old crow probably didn't know that they were ancient people. He rocked in his chair as he laughed. His laughter was very pleasing and very contagious. We are the Toltecs, Maestro, he said. Rest assured that we are. That's all I know. But you can ask the witness. He knows. I lost my interest a long time ago. He stood up and went over to the stove. I followed him. He examined a pot of food cooking on a low fire. He asked me if I knew who had made that food. I was pretty sure that Lagorda had made it, but I said that I did not know. He sniffed it 4 or 5 times in short inhalations, like a dog. Then he announced that his nose told him that Lagorda had cooked it. He asked me if I had had some, and when I said that I had finished eating just before he arrived, he took a bowl from a shelf and helped himself to an enormous portion. He recommended in very strong terms that I should eat food cooked only by Lagorda, and that I should only use her bowl, as he himself was doing. I told him that Lagorda and the little sisters had served me my food in a dark bowl that they kept on a shelf apart from the others. He said that that bowl belonged to the Nagual. We went back to the table. He ate very slowly and did not talk at all. His total absorption in eating made me realize that all of them did the same thing. They ate in complete silence. Lagorda is a great cook, he said as he finished his food. She used to feed me. That was ages ago, before she hated me, before she became a witch, I mean a Toltec. He looked at me with a glint in his eye and winked. I felt obligated to comment that Lagorda did not strike me as being capable of hating anyone. I asked him if he knew that she had lost her form. "That's a lot of baloney," he exclaimed. He stared at me as if measuring my look of surprise, and then hid his face under his arm and giggled like an embarrassed child. "Well, she actually did do that," he added. "She's just great. Why do you dislike her, then?" "I'm going to tell you something, Maestro, because I trust you. I don't dislike her at all. She's the very best. She's the Nagual's woman. I just act that way with her because I like her to pamper me, and she does. She never gets mad at me. I could do anything. Sometimes I get carried away and I get physical with her and want to strike her. When that happens, she just jumps out of the way, like the Nagual used to do. The next minute she doesn't even remember what I did. That's a true formless warrior for you. She does the same thing with everyone. But the rest of us are a sorry mess. We are truly bad. Those three witches hate us and we hate them back. You are sorcerers, Pablito, can't you stop all this bickering?" "Sure we can, but we don't want to. What do you expect us to do, be like brothers and sisters?" I did not know what to say. They were the Nagual's women, he went on. And yet everybody expected me to take them. How in heaven's name am I going to do that? I tried with one of them and instead of helping me, the bastardly witch nearly killed me. So now every one of those women is after my hide as if I had committed a crime. All I did was to follow the Nagual's instructions. He told me that I had to be intimate with each of them, one by one, until I could hold all of them at once. But I couldn't be intimate with even one. I wanted to ask him about his mother, Doña Soledad, but I could not figure out a way to bring her into the conversation at that point. We were quiet for a moment. "Do you hate them for what they tried to do to you?" he asked all of a sudden. I saw my chance. "No, not at all," I said. Lagorda explained to me their reasons. But Doña Soledad's attack was very scary. "Do you see much of her?" He did not answer. He looked at the ceiling. I repeated my question. I noticed then that his eyes were filled with tears. His body shook, convulsed by quiet sobs. He said that once he had had a beautiful mother, whom, no doubt, I could still remember. Her name was Manuelita, a saintly woman who raised 2 children, working like a mule to support them. He felt the most profound veneration for that mother who had loved and reared him. But one horrible day his fate was fulfilled, and he had the misfortune to meet Gennaro and the Nagual, and between the two of them they destroyed his life. In a very emotional tone, Pablito said that the 2 devils took his soul and his mother's soul. They killed his Manuelita and left behind that horrendous witch, Soledad. He peered at me with eyes flooded with tears and said that that hideous woman was not his mother. She could not possibly be his Manuelita. He sobbed uncontrollably. I did not know what to say. His emotional outburst was so genuine and his contention so truthful that I felt swayed by a tide of sentiment. Thinking as an average civilized man, I had to agree with him. It certainly looked as if it was a great misfortune for Pablito to have crossed the path of Don Juan and Don Genaro. I put my arm around his shoulders and almost wept myself. After a long silence, he stood up and went out to the back. I heard him blowing his nose and washing his face in a pail of water. When he returned, he was calmer. He was even smiling. "Don't get me wrong, Maestro," he said. "I don't blame anyone for what has happened to me. It was my fate. Genaro and the Nagual acted like the impeccable warriors they were. I'm just weak, that's all. And I have failed in my task." The Nagual said that my only chance to avoid the attack of that horrendous witch was to corral the four winds and make them into my four corners. But I failed. Those women were in cahoots with that witch Soledad and didn't want to help me. They wanted me dead. The Nagual also told me that if I failed, you wouldn't stand a chance yourself. He said that if she killed you, I had to flee and run for my life. He doubted that I could even get as far as the road. He said that with your power and with what the witch already knows, she would have been peerless. So, when I felt I had failed to corral the four winds, I considered myself dead. And of course I hated those women. But today, Maestro, you bring me new hope. I told him that his feelings for his mother had touched me very deeply. I was in fact appalled by all that had happened, but I doubted intensely that I had brought hope of any kind to him. "You have," he exclaimed with great certainty. "I've felt terrible all this time. To have your own mother coming after you with an axe is nothing anyone can feel happy about. But now she's out of the way, thanks to you and whatever you did. Those women hate me because they're convinced I'm a coward. They just can't get it through their thick heads that we are different. You and those four women are different than me and the witness and Benigno in one important way. All five of you were pretty much dead before the Nagual found you. He told us that once you had even tried to kill yourself. We were not that way. We were well and alive and happy. We are the opposite of you. You are desperate people, we are not. If Genaro hadn't come my way, I would be a happy carpenter today. Or perhaps I would have died. It doesn't matter. I would have done what I could and that would have been fine." His words plunged me into a curious mood. I had to admit that he was right in that those women and myself were indeed desperate people. If I had not met Don Juan, I would no doubt be dead, but I could not say, as Pablito had, that it would have been fine with me either way. Don Juan had brought life and vigor to my body and freedom to my spirit. Pablito's statements made me remember something Don Juan had told me once when we were talking about an old man, a friend of mine. Don Juan had said in very emphatic terms that the old man's life or death had no significance whatsoever. I felt a bit cross at what I thought to be redundance on Don Juan's part. I told him that it went without saying that the life and death of that old man had no significance, since nothing in the world could possibly have any significance except to each one of us personally. "You said it," he exclaimed, and laughed. "That's exactly what I mean. That old man's life and death have no significance to him personally. He could have died in 1929, or in 1950, or he could live until 1995. It doesn't matter. Everything is stupidly the same to him. My life before I met Don Juan had been that way. Nothing had ever mattered to me. I used to act as if certain things affected me, but that was only a calculated ploy to appear as a sensitive man. Pablito spoke to me and disrupted my reflections. He wanted to know if he had hurt my feelings. I assured him that it was nothing. In order to start up the conversation again, I asked him where he had met Don Genaro. My fate was that my boss got ill, he said. And I had to go to the city market in his place to build a new section of clothing booths. I worked there for 2 months. While I was there, I met the daughter of the owner of one of the booths. We fell in love. I built her father's stand a little bigger than the others so I could make love to her under the counter while her sister took care of the customers. One day Genaro brought a sack of medicinal plants to a retailer across the aisle, and while they were talking he noticed that the clothing stand was shaking. He looked carefully at the stand, but he only saw the sister sitting on a chair half asleep. The man told Genaro that every day the stand shook like that around that hour. The next day Genaro brought the Nagual to watch the stand shaking, and sure enough that day it shook. They came back the next day and it shook again. So they waited there until I came out. That day I made their acquaintance, and soon after Genaro told me that he was an herbalist and proposed to make me a potion that no woman could resist. I liked women, so I fell for it. He certainly made the potion for me, but it took him 10 years. In the meantime I got to know him very well, and I grew to love him more than if he were my own brother. And now I miss him like hell. So you see, he tricked me. Sometimes I'm glad that he did, most of the time I resent it, though. Don Juan told me that sorcerers have to have an omen before they choose someone. Was there something of that sort with you, Pablito? Yes. Genaro said that he got curious watching the stand shaking, and then he saw that 2 people were making love under the counter. So he sat down to wait for the people to come out. He wanted to see who they were. After a while the girl appeared in the stand, but he missed me. He thought it was very strange that he would miss me after being so determined to set eyes on me. The next day he came back with the Nagual. He also saw that 2 people were making love, but when it was time to catch me, they both missed me. They came back again the next day. Genaro went around to the back of the stand, while the Nagual stayed out in front. I bumped into Genaro while I was crawling out. I thought he hadn't seen me because I was still behind a piece of cloth that covered a small square opening I had made on the side wall. I began to bark to make him think there was a small dog under the drape. He growled and barked back at me, and really made me believe that there was a huge mad dog on the other side. I got so scared I ran out the other way and crashed into the Nagual. If he would have been an ordinary man, I would have thrown him to the ground because I ran right into him, but instead, he lifted me up like a child. I was absolutely flabbergasted. For being such an old man, he was truly strong. I thought I could use a strong man like that to carry lumber for me. Besides, I didn't want to lose face with the people who had seen me running out from under the counter. I asked him if he would like to work for me. He said yes. That same day he went to the shop and started to work as my assistant. He worked there every day for 2 months. I didn't have a chance with those 2 devils. The incongruous image of Don Juan working for Pablito was extremely humorous to me. Pablito began to imitate the way Don Juan carried lumber on his shoulders. I had to agree with Lagorda that Pablito was as good an actor as Josefina. Why did they go to all that trouble, Pablito? They had to trick me. You don't think that I would go with them just like that, do you? I've heard all my life about sorcerers and curers and witches and spirits, and I never believed a word of it. Those who talked about things like that were just ignorant people. If Gennaro had told me that he and his friend were sorcerers, I would have walked out on them. But they were too clever for me. Those two foxes were really sly. They were in no hurry. Gennaro said that he would have waited for me if it took him 20 years. That's why the Nagual went to work for me. I asked him to, so it was really me who gave them the key. The Nagual was a diligent worker. I was a little bit of a rascal in those days, and I thought I was the one playing a trick on him. I believed that the Nagual was just a stupid old Indian. So I told him that I was going to tell the boss that he was my grandpa, otherwise they wouldn't hire him, but I had to get a percentage of his salary. The Nagual said that it was fine with him. He gave me something out of the few pesos he made each day. My boss was very impressed with my grandpa because he was such a hard worker. But the other guys made fun of him. As you know, he had the habit of cracking all his joints from time to time. In the shop he cracked them every time he carried anything. People naturally thought that he was so old that when he carried something on his back his whole body creaked. I was pretty miserable with the Nagual as my grandpa. But by then Gennaro had already prevailed on my greedy side. He had told me that he was feeding the Nagual a special formula made out of plants, and that it made him strong as a bull. Every day he used to bring a small bundle of mashed up green leaves and feed it to him. Gennaro said that his friend was nothing without his concoction, and to prove it to me he didn't give it to him for 2 days. Without the green stuff the Nagual seemed to be just a plain, ordinary old man. Gennaro told me that I could also use his concoction to make women love me. I got very interested in it, and he said that we could be partners if I would help him prepare his formula and give it to his friend. One day he showed me some American money and told me he had sold his first batch to an American. That hooked me and I became his partner. My partner Gennaro and I had great designs. He said that I should have my own shop, because with the money that we were going to make with his formula, I could afford anything. I bought a shop and my partner paid for it. So I went wild. I knew that my partner was for real, and I began to work making his green stuff. I had the strange conviction at that point that Don Gennaro must have used psychotropic plants in making his concoction. I reasoned that he must have tricked Pablito into ingesting it in order to assure his compliance. "Did he give you power plants, Pablito?" I asked. "Sure," he replied. "He gave me his green stuff. I ate tons of it." He described and imitated how Don Juan would sit by the front door of Don Gennaro's house in a state of profound lethargy, and then spring to life as soon as his lips touched the concoction. Pablito said that in view of such a transformation he was forced to try it himself. "What was in that formula?" I asked. "Green leaves," he replied. "Any green leaves he could get a hold of." That was the kind of devil Gennaro was. He used to talk about his formula and make me laugh until I was as high as a kite. God, I really loved those days. I laughed out of nervousness. Pablito shook his head from side to side and cleared his throat 2 or 3 times. He seemed to be struggling not to weep. As I've already said. "Maestro," he went on, I was driven by greed. I secretly planned to dump my partner once I had learned how to make the green stuff myself. Gennaro must have always known the designs I had in those days, and just before he left, he hugged me and told me that it was time to fulfill my wish. It was time to dump my partner, for I had already learned to make the green stuff. Pablito stood up. His eyes were filled with tears. "That son of a gun Gennaro," he said softly. "That rotten devil. I truly loved him, and if I weren't the coward I am, I would be making his green stuff today. I didn't want to write anymore." To dispel my sadness, I told Pablito that we should go look for Nestor. I was arranging my notebooks in order to leave when the front door was flung open with a loud bang. Pablito and I jumped up involuntarily and quickly turned to look. Nestor was standing at the door. I ran to him. We met in the middle of the front room. He sort of leaped on me and shook me by the shoulders. He looked taller and stronger than the last time I had seen him. His long, lean body had acquired an almost feline smoothness. Somehow, the person facing me, peering at me, was not the Nestor I had known. I remembered him as a very shy man who was embarrassed to smile because of crooked teeth, a man who was entrusted to Pablito for his care. The Nestor who was looking at me was a mixture of Don Juan and Don Gennaro. He was wiry and agile like Don Gennaro, but had the mesmeric command that Don Juan had. I wanted to indulge in being perplexed, but all I could do was laugh with him. He patted me on the back. He took off his hat. Only then did I realize that Pablito did not have one. I also noticed that Nestor was much darker and more rugged. Next to him, Pablito looked almost frail. Both of them wore American Levi's, heavy jackets and crepe-soled shoes. Nestor's presence in the house lightened up the oppressive mood instantly. I asked him to join us in the kitchen. "You came right in time," Pablito said to Nestor with an enormous smile as we sat down. "The maestro and I were weeping here, remembering the Toltec devils." "Were Jan really crying?" "Maestro?" Nestor asked with a malicious grin on his face. "You bet he was," Pablito replied. A very soft cracking noise at the front door made Pablito and Nestor stop talking. If I had been by myself, I would not have noticed or heard anything. Pablito and Nestor stood up. I did the same. We looked at the front door. It was being opened in a most careful manner. I thought that perhaps Lagorda had returned and was quietly opening the door so as not to disturb us. When the door was finally opened wide enough to allow one person to go through, Benigno came in as if he were sneaking into a dark room. His eyes were shut and he was walking on the tips of his toes. He reminded me of a kid sneaking into a movie theater through an unlocked exit door in order to see a matinee, not daring to make any noise and at the same time not capable of seeing a thing in the dark. Everybody was quietly looking at Benigno. He opened one eye just enough to peek out of it and orient himself, and then he tiptoed across the front room to the kitchen. He stood by the table for a moment with his eyes closed. Pablito and Nestor sat down and signaled me to do the same. Benigno then slid next to me on the bench. He gently shoved my shoulder with his head. It was a light tap in order for me to move over to make room for him on the bench. Then he sat down comfortably with his eyes still closed. He was dressed in Levi's like Pablito and Nestor. His face had filled out a bit since the last time I had seen him, years before, and his hairline was different, but I could not tell how. He had a lighter complexion than I remembered, very small teeth, full lips, high cheekbones, a small nose and big ears. He had always seemed to me like a child whose features had not matured. Pablito and Nestor, who had interrupted what they were saying to watch Benigno's entrance, resumed talking as soon as he sat down as though nothing had happened. "Sure, he was crying with me," Pablito said. "He's not a crybaby like you," Nestor said to Pablito. Then he turned to me and embraced me. "I'm so glad you're alive," he said. "We've just talked to Lagorda, and she said that you were the Nagual, but she didn't tell us how you survived." "How did you survive, Maestro?" At that point I had a strange choice. I could have followed my rational path, as I had always done, and said that I did not have the vaguest idea, and I would have been truthful at that. Or I could have said that my double had extricated me from the grip of those women. I was measuring in my mind the possible effect of each alternative when I was distracted by Benigno. He opened one eye a little bit and looked at me, and then giggled and buried his head in his arms. "Benigno, don't you want to talk to me?" I asked. He shook his head negatively. I felt self-conscious with him next to me and decided to ask what was the matter with him. "What's he doing?" I asked Nestor in a low voice. Nestor rubbed Benigno's head and shook him. Benigno opened his eyes and then closed them again. "He's that way, you know," Nestor said to me. "He's extremely shy. He'll open his eyes sooner or later. Don't pay any attention to him. If he gets bored he'll go to sleep." Benigno shook his head affirmatively without opening his eyes. "Well, how did you get out?" Nestor insisted. "Don't you want to tell us?" Pablito asked. I deliberately said that my double had come out from the top of my head 3 times. I gave them an account of what had happened. They did not seem in the least surprised and took my account as a matter of course. Pablito became delighted with his own speculations that Doña Soledad might not recover and might eventually die. He wanted to know if I had struck Lydia as well. Nestor made an imperative gesture for him to be quiet, and Pablito meekly stopped in the middle of a sentence. "I'm sorry, Maestro," Nestor said, "but that was not your double. But everyone said that it was my double. I know for a fact that you misunderstood Lagorda, because as Benigno and I were walking to Gennaro's house, Lagorda overtook us on the road and told us that you and Pablito were here in this house. She called you the Nagual. Do you know why?" I laughed and said that I believed it was due to her notion that I had gotten most of the Nagual's luminosity. "One of us here is a fool," Benigno said in a booming voice without opening his eyes. The sound of his voice was so outlandish that I jumped away from him. His thoroughly unexpected statement, plus my reaction to it, made all of them laugh. Benigno opened one eye and looked at me for an instant, and then buried his face in his arms. "Do you know why we called Juan Matus the Nagual?" Nestor asked me. I said that I had always thought that that was their nice way of calling Don Juan a sorcerer. Benigno laughed so loudly that the sound of his laughter drowned out everybody else's. He seemed to be enjoying himself immensely. He rested his head on my shoulder, as if it were a heavy object he could no longer support. "The reason we called him the Nagual," Nestor went on, "is because he was split in 2. In other words, any time he needed to, he could get into another track that we don't have ourselves. Something would come out of him, something that was not a double, but a horrendous, menacing shape that looked like him but was twice his size. We call that shape the Nagual, and anybody who has it is, of course, the Nagual. The Nagual told us that all of us can have that shape coming out of our heads if we wanted to, but chances are that none of us would want to. Genero didn't want it, so I think we don't want it either. So it appears that you're the one who's stuck with it. They cackled and yelled as if they were corralling a herd of cattle. Benigno put his arms around my shoulders without opening his eyes and laughed until tears were rolling down his cheeks. "Why do you say that I am stuck with it?" I asked Nestor. "It takes too much energy," he said, "too much work. I don't know how you can still be standing. The Nagual and Genero split you once in the eucalyptus grove. They took you there because eucalyptuses are your trees. I was there myself and I witnessed when they split you and pulled your Nagual out. They pulled you apart by the ears until they had split your luminosity, and you were not an egg anymore, but two long chunks of luminosity. Then they put you together again, but any sorcerer that sees can tell that there is a huge gap in the middle. What's the advantage of being split? You have one car that hears everything and one eye that sees everything, and you will always be able to go an extra mile in a moment of need. That splitting is also the reason why they told us that you are the maestro. They tried to split Pablito, but it looks like it failed. He's too pampered and has always indulged like a bastard. That's why he's so screwed up now. What's a double then? A double is the other, the body that one gets in dreaming. It looks exactly like oneself. Do all of you have a double? Nestor scrutinized me with a look of surprise. Hey, Pablito, tell the maestro about our doubles, he said, laughing. Pablito reached across the table and shook Benigno. You tell him, Benigno, he said. Better yet, show it to him. Benigno stood up, opened his eyes as wide as he could and looked at the roof. Then he pulled down his pants and showed me his penis. The Generos went wild with laughter. Did you really mean it when you asked that, maestro? Nestor asked me with a nervous expression. I assured him that I was deadly serious in my desire to know anything related to their knowledge. I went into a long elucidation of how Don Juan had kept me outside of their realm for reasons I could not fathom, thus preventing me from knowing more about them. Think of this, I said. I didn't know until 3 days ago that those 4 girls were the Nagual's apprentices, or that Benigno was Don Genero's apprentice. Benigno opened his eyes. Think of this yourself, he said. I didn't know until now that you were so stupid. He closed his eyes again and all of them laughed insanely. I had no choice but to join them. We were just teasing you. Maestro, Nestor said in way of an apology. We thought that you were teasing us, rubbing it in. The Nagual told us that you see. If you do, you can tell that we are a sorry lot. We don't have the body of dreaming. None of us has a double. In a very serious and earnest manner, Nestor said that something had come in between them and their desire to have a double. I understood him as saying that a sort of barrier had been created since Don Juan and Don Genero had left. He thought that it might be the result of Pablito flubbing his task. Pablito added that since the Nagual and Genero had gone, something seemed to be chasing them, and even Benigno, who was living in the southernmost tip of Mexico at that time, had to return. Only when the 3 of them were together did they feel at ease. What do you think it is? I asked Nestor. There is something out there in that immensity that's pulling us, he replied. Pablito thinks it's his fault for antagonizing those women. Pablito turned to me. There was an intense glare in his eyes. "They've put a curse on me. Maestro," he said. "I know that the cause of all our trouble is me. I wanted to disappear from these parts after my fight with Lydia, and a few months later I took off for Veracruz. I was actually very happy there with a girl I wanted to marry. I got a job and was doing fine until one day I came home and found that those four mannish freaks, like beasts of prey, had tracked me down by my scent. They were in my house tormenting my woman. That bitch Rosa put her ugly hand on my woman's belly and made her shit in the bed, just like that. Their leader, 220 buttocks, told me that they had walked across the continent looking for me. She just grabbed me by the belt and pulled me out. They pushed me to the bus depot to bring me here. I got madder than the devil, but I was no match for 220 buttocks. She put me on the bus. But on our way here I ran away. I ran through bushes and over hills until my feet got so swollen that I couldn't get my shoes off. I nearly died. I was ill for 9 months. If the witness hadn't found me, I would have died. I didn't find him, Nestor said to me. Lagorda found him. She took me to where he was, and between the two of us we carried him to the bus and brought him here. He was delirious, and we had to pay an extra fare so that the bus driver would let him stay on the bus. In a most dramatic tone, Pablito said that he had not changed his mind. He still wanted to die. But why? I asked him. Benigno answered for him in a booming, guttural voice. Because his pecker doesn't work, he said. The sound of his voice was so extraordinary that for an instant I had the impression that he was talking inside a cavern. It was at once frightening and incongruous. I laughed almost out of control. Nestor said that Pablito had attempted to fulfill his task of establishing sexual relations with the women, in accordance with the Nagual's instructions. He had told Pablito that the four corners of his world were already set in position, and all he had to do was to claim them. But when Pablito went to claim his first corner, Lydia, she nearly killed him. Nestor added that it was his personal opinion as a witness of the event that the reason Lydia rammed him with her head was because Pablito could not perform as a man, and rather than being embarrassed by the whole thing, she hit him. Did Pablito really get sick as a result of that blow, or was he pretending? I asked half in jest. Benigno answered again in the same booming voice. He was just pretending, he said. All he got was a bump on the head. Pablito and Nestor cackled and yelled. We don't blame Pablito for being afraid of those women, Nestor said. They are all like the Nagual himself, fearsome warriors. They're mean and crazy. Do you really think they're that bad? I asked him. To say they're bad is only one part of the whole truth, Nestor said. They're just like the Nagual. They're serious and gloomy. When the Nagual was around, they used to sit close to him and stare into the distance with half-closed eyes for hours, sometimes for days. Is it true that Josefina was really crazy a long time ago? I asked. That's a laugh, Pablito said. Not a long time ago, she's crazy now. She's the most insane of the bunch. I told them what she had done to me. I thought that they would appreciate the humor of her magnificent performance. But my story seemed to affect them the wrong way. They listened to me like frightened children. Even Benigno opened his eyes to listen to my account. Wow! Pablito exclaimed. Those bitches are really awful. And you know that their leader is 220 buttocks. She's the one that throws the rock and then hides her hand and pretends to be an innocent little girl. Be careful of her, maestro. The nag will train Josefina to be anything, Nestor said. She can do anything you want. Cry, laugh, get angry, anything. But what is she like when she is not acting? I asked Nestor. She's just crazier than a bat, Benigno answered in a soft voice. I met Josefina the first day she arrived. I had to carry her into the house. The Nagual and I used to tie her down to her bed all the time. Once she began to cry for her friend, a little girl she used to play with. She cried for 3 days. Pablito consoled her and fed her like a baby. She's like him. Both of them don't know how to stop once they begin. Benigno suddenly began to sniff the air. He stood up and went over to the stove. Is he really shy? I asked Nestor. He's shy and eccentric, Pablito answered. He'll be that way until he loses his form. Genero told us that we will lose our form sooner or later, so there is no point in making ourselves miserable in trying to change ourselves the way the Nagual told us to. Genero told us to enjoy ourselves and not worry about anything. You and the women worry and try, we on the other hand, enjoy. You don't know how to enjoy things, and we don't know how to make ourselves miserable. The Nagual called making yourself miserable impeccability. We call it stupidity, don't we? You are speaking for yourself, Pablito, Nestor said. Benigno and I don't feel that way. Benigno brought a bowl of food over and placed it in front of me. He served everyone. Pablito examined the bowls and asked Benigno where he had found them. Benigno said that they were in a box where Lagorda had told him she had stored them. Pablito confided in me that those bowls used to belong to them before their split. We have to be careful, Pablito said in a nervous tone. These bowls are no doubt bewitched. Those bitches put something in them. I'd rather eat out of Lagorda's bowl. Nestor and Benigno began to eat. I noticed then that Benigno had given me the brown bowl. Pablito seemed to be in a great turmoil. I wanted to put him at ease, but Nestor stopped me. Don't take him so seriously, he said. He loves to be that way. He'll sit down and eat. This is where you and the women fail. There is no way for you to understand that Pablito is like that. You expect everybody to be like the Nagual. Lagorda is the only one who's unruffled by him, not because she understands, but because she has lost her form. Pablito sat down to eat, and among the 4 of us we finished a whole pot of food. Benigno washed the bowls and carefully put them back in the box, and then all of us sat down comfortably around the table. Nestor proposed that as soon as it got dark we should all go for a walk in a ravine nearby, where Don Juan, Don Genero and I used to go. I felt somehow reluctant. I did not feel confident enough in their company. Nestor said that they were used to walking in the darkness, and that the art of a sorcerer was to be inconspicuous, even in the midst of people. I told him what Don Juan had once said to me, before he had left me in a deserted place in the mountains not too far from there. He had demanded that I concentrate totally on trying not to be obvious. He said that the people of the area knew everyone by sight. There were not very many people, but those who lived there walked around all the time and could spot a stranger from miles away. He told me that many of those people had firearms and would have thought nothing of shooting me. Don't be concerned with beings from the other world, Don Juan had said, laughing. The dangerous ones are the Mexicans. That's still valid, Nestor said. That has been valid all the time. That's why the Nagual and Genero were the artists they were. They learned to become unnoticeable in the middle of all this. They knew the art of stalking. It was still too early for our walk in the dark. I wanted to use the time to ask Nestor my critical question. I had been avoiding it all along. Some strange feeling had prevented me from asking. It was as if I had exhausted my interest after Pablito's reply. But Pablito himself came to my aid, and all of a sudden he brought up the subject as if he had been reading my mind. Nestor also jumped into the abyss the same day we did, he said. And in that way he became the witness, you became the maestro, and I became the village idiot. In a casual manner I asked Nestor to tell me about his jump into the abyss. I tried to sound only mildly interested. But Pablito was aware of the true nature of my forced indifference. He laughed and told Nestor that I was being cautious because I had been deeply disappointed with his own account of the event. I went over after you two did, Nestor said, and looked at me as if waiting for another question. Did you jump immediately after us? I asked. No. It took me quite a while to get ready, he said. Genero and the Nagual didn't tell me what to do. That day was a test day for all of us. Pablito seemed despondent. He stood up from his chair and paced the room. He sat down again, shaking his head in a gesture of despair. Did you actually see us going over the edge? I asked Nestor. I am the witness, he said. To witness was my path of knowledge, to tell you impeccably what I witness is my task. But what did you really see? I asked. I saw you two holding each other and running toward the edge, he said. And then I saw you both like two kites against the sky. Pablito moved farther out in a straight line and then fell down. You went up a little and then you moved away from the edge a short distance before falling down. But did we jump with our bodies? I asked. Well, I don't think there was another way to do it, he said, and laughed. Could it have been an illusion? I asked. What are you trying to say? Maestro? He asked in a dry tone. I want to know what really happened, I said. Did you by any chance black out, like Pablito? Nestor asked with a glint in his eye. I tried to explain to him the nature of my quandary about the jump. He could not hold still and interrupted me. Pablito intervened to bring him to order and they became involved in an argument. Pablito squeezed himself out of it by walking half-seated around the table, holding onto his chair. Nestor doesn't see beyond his nose, he said to me. Benigno is the same. You'll get nothing from them. At least you got my sympathy. Pablito cackled, making his shoulders shiver, and hid his face with Benigno's hat. As far as I'm concerned, you two jumped, Nestor said to me in a sudden outburst. Genero and the Nagual had left you with no other choice. That was their art, to corral you and then lead you to the only gate that was open. And so you two went over the edge. That was what I witnessed. Pablito says that he didn't feel a thing. That is questionable. I know that he was perfectly aware of everything, but he chooses to feel and say that he wasn't. I really wasn't aware, Pablito said to me in an apologetic tone. Perhaps, Nestor said dryly. But I was aware myself, and I saw your bodies doing what they had to do, jump. Nestor's assertions put me in a strange frame of mind. All along I had been seeking validation for what I had perceived myself, But once I had it, I realized that it made no difference. To know that I had jumped and to be afraid of what I had perceived was one thing. To seek consensual validation was another. I knew then that one had no necessary correlation with the other. I had thought all along that to have someone else corroborate that I had taken that plunge would absolve my intellect of its doubts and fears. I was wrong. I became instead more worried, more involved with the issue. I began to tell Nestor that although I had come to see the two of them for the specific purpose of having them confirm that I had jumped, I had changed my mind, and I really did not want to talk about it anymore. Both of them started talking at once, and at that point we fell into a three-way argument. Pablito maintained that he had not been aware, Nestor shouted that Pablito was indulging, and I said that I didn't want to hear anything more about the jump. It was blatantly obvious to me for the first time that none of us had calmness and self-control. None of us was willing to give the other person our undivided attention, the way Don Juan and Don Genaro did. Since I was incapable of maintaining any order in our exchange of opinions, I immersed myself in my own deliberations. I had always thought that the only flaw that had prevented me from entering fully into Don Juan's world was my insistence on rationalizing everything, but the presence of Pablito and Nestor had given me a new insight into myself. Another flaw of mine was my timidity. Once I strayed outside the safe railings of common sense, I could not trust myself and became intimidated by the awesomeness of what unfolded in front of me. Thus, I found it was impossible to believe that I had jumped into an abyss. Don Juan had insisted that the whole issue of sorcery was perception, and truthful to that, he and Don Genaro staged, for our last meeting, an immense cathartic drama on the flat mountaintop. After they made me voice my thanks in loud clear words to everyone who had ever helped me, I became transfixed with elation. At that point they had caught all my attention and led my body to perceive the only possible act within their frame of references. The jump into the abyss. That jump was the practical accomplishment of my perception, not as an average man, but as a sorcerer. I had been so absorbed in writing down my thoughts I had not noticed that Nestor and Pablito had stopped talking, and all three of them were looking at me. I explained to them that there was no way for me to understand what had taken place with that jump. "There's nothing to understand," Nestor said. "Things just happen and no one can tell how. Ask Benigno if he wants to understand." "Do you want to understand?" I asked Benigno as a joke. "You bet I do," he exclaimed in a deep bass voice, making everyone laugh. "You indulge in saying that you want to understand," Nestor went on. "Just like Pablito indulges in saying that he doesn't remember anything." He looked at Pablito and winked at me. Pablito lowered his head. Nestor asked me if I had noticed something about Pablito's mood when we were about to take our plunge. I had to admit that I had been in no position to notice anything so subtle as Pablito's mood. "A warrior must notice everything," he said. "That's his trick, and as the Nagual said, there lies his advantage." He smiled and made a deliberate gesture of embarrassment, hiding his face with his hat. "What was it that I missed about Pablito's mood?" I asked him. "Pablito had already jumped before he went over," he said. "He didn't have to do anything. He may as well have sat down on the edge instead of jumping." "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "Pablito was already disintegrating," he replied. "That's why he thinks he passed out. Pablito lies. He's hiding something." Pablito began to speak to me. He muttered some unintelligible words, then gave up and slumped back in his chair. Nestor also started to say something. I made him stop. I was not sure I had understood him correctly. Was Pablito's body disintegrating? I asked. He peered at me for a long time without saying a word. He was sitting to my right. He moved quietly to the bench opposite me. You must take what I say seriously, he said. There is no way to turn back the wheel of time to what we were before that jump. The Nagual said that it is an honor and a pleasure to be a warrior, and that it is the warrior's fortune to do what he has to do. I have to tell you impeccably what I have witnessed. Pablito was disintegrating. As you two ran toward the edge, only you were solid. Pablito was like a cloud. He thinks that he was about to fall on his face, and you think that you held him by the arm to help him make it to the edge. Neither of you is correct, and I wouldn't doubt that it would have been better for both of you if you hadn't picked Pablito up. I felt more confused than ever. I truly believed that he was sincere in reporting what he had perceived, but I remembered that I had only held Pablito's arm. What would have happened if I hadn't interfered? I asked. I can't answer that, Nestor replied. But I know that you affected each other's luminosity. At the moment you put your arm around him, Pablito became more solid, but you wasted your precious power for nothing. What did you do after we jumped? I asked Nestor after a long silence. Right after you two had disappeared, he said, my nerves were so shattered that I couldn't breathe and I too passed out, I don't know for how long. I thought it was only for a moment. When I came to my senses again, I looked around for Gennaro and Nagual. They were gone. I ran back and forth on the top of that mountain, calling them until my voice was hoarse. Then I knew I was alone. I walked to the edge of the cliff and tried to look for the sign that the earth gives when a warrior is not going to return, but I had already missed it. I knew then that Gennaro and the Nagual were gone forever. I had not realized until then that they had turned to me after they had said goodbye to you too, and as you were running to the edge, they waved their hands and said goodbye to me. Finding myself alone at that time of day, on that deserted spot, was more than I could bear. In one sweep I had lost all the friends I had in the world. I sat down and wept. And as I got more and more scared, I began to scream as loud as I could. I called Gennaro's name at the top of my voice. By then it was pitch black. I could no longer distinguish any landmarks. I knew that as a warrior I had no business indulging in my grief. In order to calm myself down, I began to howl like a coyote, the way the Nagual had taught me. After howling for a while, I felt so much better that I forgot my sadness. I forgot that the world existed. The more I howled, the easier it was to feel the warmth and protection of the earth. Hours must have passed. Suddenly I felt a blow inside of me, behind my throat, and the sound of a bell in my cars. I remembered what the Nagual had told Eligio and Benigno before they jumped. He said that the feeling in the throat came just before one was ready to change speed, and that the sound of the bell was the vehicle that one could use to accomplish anything that one needed. I wanted to be a coyote then. I looked at my arms, which were on the ground in front of me. They had changed shape and looked like a coyote's. I saw the coyote's fur on my arms and chest. I was a coyote. That made me so happy that I cried like a coyote must cry. I felt my coyote teeth and my long and pointed muzzle and tongue. Somehow, I knew that I had died, but I didn't care. It didn't matter to me to have turned into a coyote, or to be dead, or to be alive. I walked like a coyote, on 4 legs, to the edge of the precipice and leaped into it. There was nothing else for me to do. I felt that I was falling down and my coyote body turned in the air. Then I was myself again, twirling in midair. But before I hit the bottom, I became so light that I didn't fall anymore but floated. The air went through me. I was so light. I believed that my death was finally coming inside me. Something stirred my insides and I disintegrated like dry sand. It was peaceful and perfect where I was. I somehow knew that I was there, and yet I wasn't. I was nothing. That's all I can say about it. Then, quite suddenly, the same thing that had made me like dry sand put me together again. I came back to life and I found myself sitting in the hut of an old Mazatec sorcerer. He told me his name was Porfirio. He said that he was glad to see me and began to teach me certain things about plants that Gennaro hadn't taught me. He took me with him to where the plants were being made and showed me the mold of plants, especially the marks on the molds. He said that if I watched for those marks in the plants, I could easily tell what they're good for, even if I had never seen those plants before. Then when he knew that I had learned the marks, he said goodbye, but invited me to come see him again. At that moment I felt a strong pull and I disintegrated, like before. I became a million pieces. Then I was pulled again into myself and went back to see Porfirio. He had, after all, invited me. I knew that I could have gone anywhere I wanted, but I chose Porfirio's hut because he was kind to me and taught me. I didn't want to risk finding awful things instead. Porfirio took me this time to see the mold of the animals. There I saw my own Nagual animal. We knew each other on sight. Porfirio was delighted to see such friendship. I saw Pablitos and your own Nagual too, but they didn't want to talk to me. They seemed sad. I didn't insist on talking to them. I didn't know how you had fared in your jump. I knew that I was dead myself, but my Nagual said that I wasn't and that you both were also alive. I asked about Eligio, and my Nagual said that he was gone forever. I remembered then that when I had witnessed Eligio's and Benigno's jump, I had heard the Nagual giving Benigno instructions not to seek bizarre visions or worlds outside his own. The Nagual told him to learn only about his own world, because in doing so he would find the only form of power available to him. The Nagual gave them specific instructions to let their pieces explode as far as they could in order to restore their strength. I did the same myself. I went back and forth from the tonal to the Nagual 11 times. Every time, however, I was received by Porfirio, who instructed me further. Every time my strength waned, I restored it in the Nagual until a time when I restored it so much that I found myself back on this earth. Doña Soledad told me that Eligio didn't have to jump into the abyss, I said. He jumped with Benigno, Nestor said. Ask him, he'll tell you in his favorite voice. I turned to Benigno and asked him about his jump. You bet we jumped together, he replied in a blasting voice. But I never talk about it. What did Soledad say Eligio did? Nestor asked. I told them that Doña Soledad had said that Eligio was twirled by a wind and left the world while he was working in an open field. She's thoroughly confused, Nestor said. Eligio was twirled by the Allies. But he didn't want any of them, so they let him go. That has nothing to do with the jump. Lagorda said that you had a bout with allies last night. I don't know what you did, but if you had wanted to catch them or entice them to stay with you, you had to spin with them. Sometimes they come of their own accord to the sorcerer and spin him. Eligio was the best warrior there was, so the allies came to him of their own accord. If any of us want the allies, we would have to beg them for years, and even if we did, I doubt that the allies would consider helping us. Eligio had to jump like everybody else. I witnessed his jump. He was paired with Benigno. A lot of what happens to us as sorcerers depends on what your partner does. Benigno is a bit off his rocker because his partner didn't come back. Isn't that so, Benigno? You bet it is. Benigno answered in his favorite voice. I succumbed at that point to a great curiosity that had plagued me from the first time I had heard Benigno speak. I asked him how he made his booming voice. He turned to face me. He sat up straight and pointed to his mouth as if he wanted me to look fixedly at it. I don't know. He boomed. I just open my mouth and this voice comes out of it. He contracted the muscles of his forehead, curled up his lips, and made a profound booing sound. I then saw that he had tremendous muscles in his temples, which had given his head a different contour. It was not his hairline that was different, but the whole upper front part of his head. General left him his noises, Nestor said to me. Wait until he farts. I had the feeling that Benigno was getting ready to demonstrate his abilities. Wait, Benigno, I said. It's not necessary. Oh, shucks. Benigno exclaimed in a tone of disappointment. I had the best one just for you. Pablito and Nestor laughed so hard that even Benigno lost his deadpan expression and cackled with them. Tell me what else happened to Eligio, I asked Nestor after they had calmed down again. After Eligio and Benigno jumped, Nestor replied, the Nagual made me look quickly over the edge in order to catch the sign the earth gives when warriors jump into the abyss. If there is something like a little cloud or a faint gust of wind, the warrior's time on earth is not over yet. The day Eligio and Benigno jumped, I felt one puff of air on the side Benigno had jumped, and I knew that his time was not up. But Eligio's side was silent. What do you think happened to Eligio? Did he die? All three of them stared at me. They were quiet for a moment. Nestor scratched his temples with both hands. Benigno giggled and shook his head. I attempted to explain, but Nestor made a gesture with his hands to stop me. Are you serious when you ask us questions? He asked me. Benigno answered for me. When he was not clowning, his voice was deep and melodious. He said that the Nagual and Genero had set us up so all of us had pieces of information that the others did not have. Well, if that's the case, we'll tell you what's what, Nestor said, smiling as if a great load had been lifted off his shoulders. Eligio did not die. Not at all. Where is he now? I asked. They looked at one another again. They gave me the feeling that they were struggling to keep from laughing. I told them that all I knew about Eligio was what Doña Soledad had told me. She had said that Eligio had gone to the other world to join the Nagual and Genero. To me that sounded as if the three of them had died. Why do you talk like that, Maestro? Nestor asked with a tone of deep concern. Not even Pablito talks like that. I thought Pablito was going to protest. He almost stood up, but he seemed to change his mind. Yes, that's right, he said. Not even I talk like that. Well, if Eligio didn't die, where is he? I asked. Solid had already told you, Nestor said softly. Eligio went to join the Nagual in Genero. I decided that it was best not to ask any more questions. I did not mean my probes to be aggressive, but they always turned out that way. Besides, I had the feeling that they did not know much more than I did. Nestor suddenly stood up and began to pace back and forth in front of me. Finally, he pulled me away from the table by my armpits. He did not want me to write. He asked me if I had really blacked out like Pablito had at the moment of jumping and did not remember anything. I told him that I had had a number of vivid dreams or visions that I could not explain, and that I had come to see them to seek clarification. They wanted to hear about all the visions I had had. After they had heard my accounts, Nestor said that my visions were of a bizarre order, and only the first two were of great importance and of this earth. The rest were visions of alien worlds. He explained that my first vision was of special value because it was an omen proper. He said that sorcerers always took a first event of any series as the blueprint or the map of what was going to develop subsequently. In that particular vision, I had found myself looking at an outlandish world. There was an enormous rock right in front of my eyes, a rock which had been split in two. Through a wide gap in it I could see a boundless phosphorescent plain, a valley of some sort, which was bathed in a greenish-yellow light. On one side of the valley, to the right, and partially covered from my view by the enormous rock, there was an unbelievable dome-like structure. It was dark, almost a charcoal gray. If my size was what it is in the world of everyday life, the dome must have been 50,000 feet high and miles across. Such an enormity dazzled me. I had a sensation of vertigo and plummeted into a state of disintegration. Once more I rebounded from it and found myself on a very uneven and yet flat surface. It was a shiny, interminable surface just like the plane I had seen before. It went as far as I could see. I soon realized that I could turn my head in any direction I wanted on a horizontal plane, but I could not look at myself. I was able, however, to examine the surroundings by rotating my head from left to right, and vice versa. Nevertheless, when I wanted to turn around to look behind me, I could not move my bulk. The plane extended itself monotonously, equally to my left and to my right. There was nothing else in sight but an endless whitish glare. I wanted to look at the ground underneath my feet, but my eyes could not move down. I lifted my head up to look at the sky. All I saw was another limitless whitish surface that seemed to be connected to the one I was standing on. I then had a moment of apprehension and felt that something was just about to be revealed to me. But the sudden and devastating jolt of disintegration stopped my revelation. Some force pulled me downward. It was as if the whitish surface had swallowed me. Nestor said that my vision of a dome was of tremendous importance because that particular shape had been isolated by the Nagual in Genero as the vision of the place where all of us were supposed to meet them someday. Benigno spoke to me at that point and said that he had heard Eligio being instructed to find that particular dome. He said that the Nagual in Genero insisted that Eligio understand their point correctly. They always had believed Eligio to be the best, therefore, they directed him to find that dome and to enter its whitish vaults over and over again. Pablito said that all three of them were instructed to find that dome if they could, but that none of them had. I said then, in a complaining tone, that neither Don Juan nor Don Genaro had ever mentioned anything like that to me. I had had no instruction of any sort regarding a dome. Benigno, who was sitting across the table from me, suddenly stood up and came to my side. He sat to my left and whispered very softly in my ear that perhaps the two old men had instructed me, but I did not remember, or that they had not said anything about it, so I would not fix my attention on it once I had found it. Why was the dome so important? I asked Nestor. Because that's where the Nagual and Genaro are now, he replied. And where's that dome? I asked. Somewhere on this earth, he said. I had to explain to them at great length that it was impossible that a structure of that magnitude could exist on our planet. I said that my vision was more like a dream, and domes of that height could exist only in fantasies. They laughed and patted me gently as if they were humoring a child. You want to know where Eligio is? Nestor said all of a sudden. Well, he is in the white vaults of that dome with the Nagual and Genaro. But that dome was a vision, I protested. Then Eligio is in a vision, Nestor said. Remember what Benigno just said to you. The Nagual and Genaro didn't tell you to find that dome and go back to it over and over. If they had, you wouldn't be here. You'd be like Eligio, in the dome of that vision. So you see, Eligio did not die like a man in the street dies. He simply did not return from his jump. His claim was staggering to me. I could not brush aside the memory of the vividness of the visions I had had, but for some strange reason I wanted to argue with him. Nestor, without giving me time to say anything, drove his point a notch further. He reminded me of one of my visions. The next to the last. That particular one had been the most nightmarish of them all. I had found myself being chased by a strange, unseen creature. I knew that it was there, but I could not see it, not because it was invisible, but because the world I was in was so incredibly unfamiliar that I could not tell what anything was. Whatever the elements of my vision were, they were certainly not from this earth. The emotional distress I experienced upon being lost in such a place was almost more than I could bear. At one moment, the surface where I stood began to shake. I felt that it was caving in under my feet, and I grabbed a sort of branch, or an appendage of a thing that reminded me of a tree, which was hanging just above my head on a horizontal plane. The instant I touched it, the thing wrapped around my wrist, as if had been filled with nerves that sensed everything. I felt that I was being hoisted to a tremendous height. I looked down and saw an incredible animal. I knew it was the unseen creature that had been chasing me. It was coming out of a surface that looked like the ground. I could see its enormous mouth open like a cavern. I heard a chilling, thoroughly unearthly roar, something like a shrill, metallic gasp, and the tentacle that had me caught unraveled and I fell into that cavernous mouth. I saw every detail of that mouth as I was falling into it. Then it closed with me inside. I felt an instantaneous pressure that mashed my body. You have already died, Nestor said. That animal ate you. You ventured beyond this world and found horror itself. Our life and our death are no more and no less real than your short life in that place and your death in the mouth of that monster. This life that we are having now is only a long vision. Don't you see? Nervous spasms ran through my body. I didn't go beyond this world, he went on, but I know what I'm talking about. I don't have tales of horror like you. All I did was to visit Porfirio 10 times. If it had been up to me, I would have gone there forever, but my 11th bounce was so powerful that it changed my direction. I felt that I had overshot Porfirio's hut, and instead of finding myself at his door, I found myself in the city, very close to the place of a friend of mine. I thought it was funny. I knew that I was journeying between the tonal and the Nagual. Nobody had said to me that the journeys had to be of any special kind. So I got curious and decided to see my friend. I began to wonder if I really would get to see him. I came to his house and knocked on the door just as I had knocked scores of times. His wife let me in as she had always done, and sure enough my friend was home. I told him that I had come to the city on business, and he even paid me some money he owed me. I put the money in my pocket. I knew that my friend and his wife and the money and his house and the city were just like Porfirio's hut, a vision. I knew that a force beyond me was going to disintegrate me any moment. So I sat down to enjoy my friend to the fullest. We laughed and joked. And I dare say that I was funny and light and charming. I stayed there for a long time, waiting for the jolt. Since it didn't come, I decided to leave. I said goodbye and thanked him for the money and for his friendship. I walked away. I wanted to see the city before the force took me away. I wandered around all night. I walked all the way to the hills overlooking the city, and at the moment the sun rose, a realization struck me like a thunderbolt. I was back in the world, and the force that will disintegrate me was at ease and was going to let me stay for a while. I was going to see my homeland and this marvelous earth for a while longer. What a great joy. Maestro? But I couldn't say that I had not enjoyed Porfirio's friendship. Both visions are equal, but I prefer the vision of my form and my earth. It's my indulging, perhaps. Nestor stopped talking and all of them stared at me. I felt threatened as I had never been before. Some part of me was in awe of what he had said, another wanted to fight with him. I began to argue with him without any sense. My inane mood lasted for a few moments, then I became aware that Benigno was looking at me with a very mean expression. He had fixed his eyes on my chest. I felt that something ominous was suddenly pressing on my heart. I began to perspire as if a heater were right in front of my face. My ears began to buzz. Lagorda walked up to me at that precise moment. She was a most unexpected sight. I was sure that the generos felt the same way. They stopped what they were doing and looked at her. Pablito was the first to recover from his surprise. "Why do you have to come in like that?" he asked in a pleading tone. "You were listening from the other room, weren't you?" She said that she had been in the house only a few minutes, and then she stepped out to the kitchen. And the reason she stayed quiet was not so much to listen, but to exercise her ability to be inconspicuous. Her presence had created a strange lull. I wanted to pick up again the flow of Nestor's revelations, but before I could say anything, Lagorda said that the little sisters were on their way to the house and would be coming through the door any minute. The generos stood up at once as if they had been pulled by the same string. Pablito put his chair on his shoulder. "Let's go for a hike in the dark." "Maestro," Pablito said to me. Lagorda said in a most imperative tone that I could not go with them yet, because she had not finished telling me everything the Nagual had instructed her to tell me. Pablito turned to me and winked. "I've told you," he said. "They're bossy, gloomy bitches. I certainly hope you're not like that, Maestro." Nestor and Benigno said good night and embraced me. Pablito just walked away carrying his chair like a backpack. They went out through the back. A few seconds later, a horribly loud bang on the front door made Lagorda and me jump to our feet. Pablito walked in again, carrying his chair. "You thought I wasn't going to say good night, didn't you?" he asked me and left laughing. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.